Hello everybody and welcome to Parashat Emor this week on the Waypoint. So, wave tops real quick, we'll just jump in because this is a fairly long Torah portion to read and pretty peculiar in certain areas, but it's mostly the holiness code for the priests, or Kohanim if you know enough Hebrew, and depending on your translation. But a lot of this is going to be focused on the holiness codes, certain things for the priests that apply directly to the priests, the priesthood, and their service. And then in chapter 23, that's when we go into the biblical feasts. We have essentially the complete list here of all of the biblical holidays, otherwise known as the Moedim. And Moedim is a little bit more appropriate because that's the word that's actually used in the Hebrew. Moed, and that it actually means appointment rather than like holiday. Holiday comes from holy day. Nothing wrong with the word holiday, but Moedim kind of portrays this idea like this is my appointment. I've made an appointment with you and you will meet me on these days because these are my appointed days. These are the days in which I have appointed. So we get the full list here. And then in chapter 24, after we've completed our list of Moedim, we have this eternal light and bread section, which is interesting enough. And it ends rather weirdly, I would say even abruptly maybe, before getting into the next parasha, on this instance in which the son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian blasphemed by pronouncing the holy name. We've actually done an entire episode on this passage specifically and how it should be translated, how it should be interpreted, how it was understood, and everything. So look for that episode if you want more information on this piece of the Torah portion. But my compatriot Brad has prepared a lesson for you on the biblical feast portion, one of the Moedim in particular, and it's very good. So stay tuned for that. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you on the other end.
Hello, and allow me to personally welcome you to this week's Waypoint podcast. This week's Parsha was fascinating to me for a number of reasons, and I actually had a difficult time choosing what I was going to make a lesson on this week. But ultimately, what stood out to me was the last few parts of the Parsha. Particularly the elements of Sukkot, which we read about in this week's parsha, and we'll get into a little bit of that here in a bit, but also the final part of it in chapter 24, where we read a number of things. Matter of fact, a lot of you are probably familiar with certain arguments regarding kind of what happens there at the end of chapter 24 and the pronunciation of the name. For those of you who don't know, this would be the chapter of Leviticus where we find the prohibition against pronouncing the divine name. And in fact, a man is capitally punished for pronouncing the name in this chapter. But prior to that, and immediately after Sukkot, we are given a few more details on elements of the tabernacle at this point. Before getting into that, I do want to note, now this will be a recording, so you may actually watch this later, but as I am recording this, it is, tonight will begin Pesach Sheni. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm recording this now, and that what stood out to me in this parsha to make a lesson on is what stood out to me, because let's talk about Pesach Sheni a bit. When receiving the ordinances for Passover, it was understood that we don't know what the future holds, right? The future is uncertain, and it was possible that unforeseen circumstances might hinder one from taking part in the Passover. And so provisions were made for them to celebrate Passover again, or to have a second chance at Passover 1 month later. So Passover being the 14th of Nisan, Pesach Sheni, right, the second chance at Passover, is 14 Iyar. It's fascinating to me, actually, that this is the case, because Passover is the first holiday of the seasonal calendar, right? That's even before mentioning anything about Pesach. Hashem says that this is to be the beginning of months for you. And so you could consider Pesach to be the firstborn of the holidays, so to speak. And so it in a sense gets a double portion, right? In that it gets a second time around. That'll become relevant here in a bit. In this week's Parsha, though, we're coming to the end of the details of the holiday cycle, right? We finish it out with Sukkot, which Sukkot shares a lot of similarities with Passover, in that it is also on the 14th day of the month in which it takes place, and it is also a 7-day festival. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, no, there's the 8th day. We'll get to that, because that is that's a relevant thought. But when you read through Leviticus 23, 34 through 36, it does specify that it is a 7-day feast. The 8th day in verse 36 is actually mentioned almost as a separate event. And then even following from verses 39 through 44, again, it only specifies that it's a 7-day feast. So where does this 8th day come from? Again, we'll get to that in a moment. But so being a 7-day festival is one of the things that Sukkot has in common with Passover. Both taking place on the 14th day, which is, again, interesting. They're both 7-day festivals. They take place on the 14th day. Sukkot in the 7th month. So Pesach on the 1st month, Sukkot in the 7th month. There's a lot of sevens actually involved in this, which is where I'm going. 14 in and of itself is double of 7. Actually, if you have the time, read through some of what Or HaChaim has written about this whole tail end of this Parsha, because he has some really great things to say about the pattern of sevens that we see through here. I'm not going to be focusing a whole lot on that, but just the fact that they're both on the 14th day, which is itself double of 7. All right, Pesach gets a double portion, so to speak. So what about Sukkot, though? What we would see here is the last day of, or the last holiday of the holiday calendar. Except again, I would actually argue that the 8th day is the last holiday of the holiday calendar. But the future, again, is uncertain. What happens if you're unable to take part in Sukkot, right? Pesach gets a Sheni, right? Pesach Sheni. Pesach gets its second time around. It gets its second chance. But Sukkot, we don't read about that. But immediately after Sukkot, we do read about the importance of pure, clear olive oil, which is used to light the lamps of the menorah. And some of you may know where I'm going with this already. There is one thing that is certain about the future. One thing that is certain about life in general, and that is the eternity that follows it, which is what the 8th day is, right? The 8th day is representative of eternity. But until that 8th day arrives, we are stuck in the cycle of 7, right? 7-day week. In this cycle of 7, there is that uncertainty. For Israel, this holiness code that we've been reading up to this point, right? All of these holidays, they would be rebelled against, which would result in exile. But that exile ultimately did see a return and a rededication of the people to the faith and of the Holy Temple and the priesthood, because another group of rebellious Jews were not rebelling against Hashem this time. Rather, they were rebelling against an idol who sought to take this holiness code from them. For those Jews in particular, the future was uncertain, and they did miss out on Sukkot in a campaign to make sure that they wouldn't miss out on the next Pesach. I don't think that it's a coincidence that immediately following the instructions regarding Sukkot, we are given the details and instructions on the very elements and instruments that those Jews held as the centerpiece for their Sukkot Sheni, for their second chance at Sukkot, which they established as an 8-day festival. The beautiful thing about that, them establishing their second Sukkot as an 8-day festival, is because eye on the prize, right? They were not looking forward to continuing the pattern of 7. They had their minds set on the one thing that is certain about the future, which is the eternity in which they would be able to serve Hashem continually and never miss another Sukkot. Beautiful about all of this, right? Beautiful about the fact that, history bears this story out, and that Hanukkah does exist as a holiday, as a Sukkot Sheni of sorts, as a second Sukkot. I saw that immediately when reading about the details of Sukkot and going directly into the elements of the olive oil and the menorah, the lampstand. What struck me about this as something that we can take into our own lives and practice is that the future isn't certain, right? I've said that a few times now. And in that uncertainty, we do fail. We miss things. We act in rebellion, so to speak, sometimes more consciously than others. But when that happens, if you keep reading, right? If you press on and try and persevere and continue, the instructions on the opportunity for our second chance are oftentimes right there, right in front of us. You just have to be willing to look. So that's my lesson for this week. I hope it's blessed you. I know that for me, this week's Parsha was certainly a blessing. So with that said, I will hand it back over to my compatriot Seamus for his final thoughts. And hope you all have a wonderful week. For those of you who were celebrating Pesach Sheni, I hope you had a wonderful Pesach Sheni. Shalom.
Thank you, Bradley, for that amazing lesson, for the insight that you have provided to us. And for my closing thoughts, I actually want to continue with this theme that you've brought up for us, these second chances. But I'm going to the Haftarah. I'm going to take a page out of your book. I'm going to go straight to the Haftarah portion, which is in Ezekiel this week. And for those of you who have already read it, you should read it. But Ezekiel chapter 44, verses 15 through 31, not very long. And interestingly enough, it coincides perfectly with our portion because it's mostly a recounting or a reiteration of the priestly laws that we saw in the beginning of Parashat Emor. And even though Brad's lesson had nothing to do with the laws pertaining to the priesthood, in the Haftarah is just a reiteration of those same laws from the beginning of our Torah portion. It fits with the theme that Brad is going for here on second chances. And the thing about Ezekiel is, you have to read it within its sort of historical context, and that will help provide a better window for you to see what I mean when I say that it fits right in line with our second chances. So, without further ado, uh, Ezekiel was the son of a priest. And so he would have been working in the temple services at some point. So these laws he probably knew intimately because he was studying them for most of his childhood in order to prepare himself for the priestly duties that he would eventually serve out. Now, unfortunately, what happens for Ezekiel is he lived during the time of the Babylonian exile. In fact, he experienced the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem before he was old enough to serve in the temple. So what ends up happening actually is he studies for his most of his boyhood to prepare himself to be in the temple and to serve Hashem faithfully. And instead, what ends up happening is the exile, the temple is destroyed, and the exile into Babylon begins. And so, this particular chapter, this portion of Ezekiel, is actually is agreed by most historians written during this exile period. And so, Ezekiel is actually sort of giving us a vision from heaven, showing that this restoration is going to happen. And him of all people, I'm sure he's looking forward to it because he was hoping for to be able to be in service of Hashem to fulfill his priestly duties, and he was unable to because of extenuating circumstances. And we see that in the Torah portions. We see that in the Torah itself. We have a Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, for when something happens and you just can't celebrate Passover for the first go around for whatever reason. You're given a second chance. And Ezekiel is looking forward to that second chance. Absolutely, he is. And so part of this whole vision that he's experiencing, there's an emotional connection that he's having. He's not just recalling these priestly duties for his own sake. He is providing a hope, a looking forward to. He is giving us a vision into the Messianic era. He's showing us that there will be a second chance, that there will be a rededication, another temple will be in place, the priestly duties will resume as they once were. And so these are important pieces that he's bringing up. He's not just bringing up these details as trivial details. I would in fact argue that instead what's happening is he is proving his hope in the restoration by providing these details. It's not enough for him to just say the temple will be restored, don't worry about it. He felt the need that it was he believed so much in the restoration that he felt it was necessary to begin reiterating these laws, to reinstill them into the people and let them know and educate them exactly how the process is going to work, because it absolutely will go back into practice, if not in his life, in the Messianic era. And that's the hope of the promise. And the second chance will always be there. And with Hanukkah being part of the theme of Brad's lesson, eventually they come out of exile. Now, Ezekiel is speaking of this during exile, and eventually they come out of exile and they rebuild the second temple. And then much later in the future, they rededicate the temple. It's a sort of, once again, a second chance. And so I think it all kind of pulls in beautifully. God never abandons his people. Even in the darkest of situations, there's always the hope and the promise of that future redemption. And it is a promise, and it absolutely will come about. The redemption is at hand, and may Mashiach come speedily in our days. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Waypoint podcast. If you like today's lesson, please consider liking, believe in the subscribe button, and supporting the ministry in any way. We really appreciate it. And we will see you next week. Shalom.